I started writing about grief in the 70s. When I began, I read every book I could find, and that was about 3 books. There just wasn't much written at that time about grief. And not knowing what else to do, I began to just utilize the groups and try to put together something. And I started off using stages of grief. Every author at that time did. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had come out with a book on death and dying, and she talked about the stages that we go through in preparing for death. So we just borrowed that and put all of it into stages. And the first book I wrote had stages, of grief. I didn't like that term very well even at the time, because it seemed too clear-cut and too organized. I don't think grief is organized. I think you flip-flop through stages, and you can be at up one and back to the other one at any time. And so I've looked for another definition or analogy, and I came up with one. Some lady somewhere said, grief is like peeling an onion. It comes off one layer at a time, and you cry a lot. And I really like that analogy, because if I handed onions out to a whole audience, nobody would have an onion exactly like everybody else's onion. Everybody would have an onion that would be different, and that's the way grief is. There are no 2 grieving experiences that are alike. If you have 2 losses, you have to grieve them individually because they're not the same. Every grieving experience is different. And that allows me to talk about some of the dimensions of grief. When I first started off, someone would always ask me, what's the hardest kind of grief? Is it harder to lose a child or a spouse? Is it harder to have a sudden death or death after a long-term illness? And my answer always would be, well, grief is just grief, and it only comes in one size, extra large, and it just hurts. But within that definition, I have to say there are some dimensions in certain kinds of grief that are heightened. Now, these dimensions are in all other kinds also, but they're heightened in these experiences of grief. For example, the grief following the death of a child has a significance dimension. And significance has become one of my favorite words, which you'll hear later. I picked the word up in Missouri. A lady was visiting with me and told me her story. She had married young in life, and her husband had died quite early. She remarried, had a family, had some children, and then a child died. And she was explaining to me the difference between the grief following the death of a spouse and the grief following the death of a child. She said the grief following the death of the spouse is a process of turning loose, of saying goodbye. And the grief following the death of a child is a process of hanging on, of trying not to say goodbye. Because she said you don't feel like the child has lived long enough to establish their significance, and you feel like you have to establish it for them. And that word resonated in me. It's like we need to walk through the world for them. The grief following the stillbirth has a lonely dimension to it, because the mother is the only one that really knows that child. She bonded from the moment of conception. She knows what college the child will go to, probably who they will marry. The father has some kind of concept because he may have gotten to feel the child kick in the womb, but the mother knows that child. And her problem then becomes explaining the significance or the value of that life to a world that thinks stillbirth is minor grief. I cannot tell you how many times I've had people walk up to me and say, I had a stillbirth 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and tonight's the first time I ever knew it was okay to grieve that. Murder or sudden death has a delayed dimension to it. Particularly murder, because until they catch the person and go through the trial, and the trial itself is a horrible experience for the family. Until that's over, the grief is kind of on hold. Other kinds of sudden death, the shock is so deep that it takes a while before they can actually begin to deal with the grieving experience. Suicide has a shattered dimension. You feel like that the onion has just been blown apart, and you have to put it back together before you can ever begin to grieve. Families will almost research. Part of the time we're looking for blame. What caused it? Who did it? Who said it? And I always say a little poem that says, "Was the final straw that broke the camel's back. Then men noticed the fiendish pack. But who among them ever saw the next to the last straw?" Because a suicide is the result of a combination or a culmination of all kinds of straws that one day become overwhelming. And it is not, well, his girlfriend quit him and therefore somebody said this and therefore. The other great problem with suicide is everybody feels so guilty. We automatically think we should have known, and we automatically think we could have stopped it, and neither are true. The only person that can stop a suicide is the person who died of suicide. And it's very difficult for us to know. I was counseling a young man one time, and we'd gone through a lot over a period of time, and he came to see me one day, and I thought, my goodness, he is so much better. He has improved. He seemed more relaxed. He had some plans for the future. I was excited when he left. 2 hours later, he shot himself. What I didn't realize is that once they make the decision, the pressure is off, and a lot of times they seem to be better. So it is very difficult for anyone to know. That doesn't mean we ignore all of the signs that they give, but it's very difficult, even with those signs, to actually know. And therefore the guilt we feel sometimes is unfounded. I also like the onion because if I handed an onion to everybody, each person would peel the onion in their own way. You know, some people would play with the little things where it comes together at the top. Some would play with the little things at the bottom. Some would peel it very daintily and very slowly. Some would just tear it apart. And the truth is, you're going to peel an onion. You're going to grieve about like you'd peel an onion. We grieve like we are, and out of who we are and the kind of personalities we are. The onion also is a good analogy. If you take the outside of an onion and you crumble it up, it becomes confetti. And if you did that and threw it up in the air, and the wind caught it, that would be a pretty good description of the first part of grieving. It's a whirl. Things are just in a whirl. It's shock. It's a period of unreality. I mean, reality's up there, but it doesn't land. You know, when my brother died, every once in a while I'd think I won't see him again, and then he'd be gone. It just hits and runs, and you're kind of torn between two feelings. Part of it is I think I'm overwhelmed. I don't think I can live over it, and the other part is I'm really angry that this happened, and it's just kind of whirling, and it's not real. It's like a lady said, we're sitting here talking about planning the funeral for my son, but I expect that door to open at any moment and him to walk in. And it's like going to a sad movie. You know, you cry, but the credits are going to roll in a minute and it'll all be different. One of the problems I have, and one of the problems that people in grief have, is we get the most help, or we give the most help when people can receive it the least. During the whirl, we're all there. Oh, we're bringing food in, we're taking care of things, we attend the funeral, and then most of us all go back home, and the family moves, and the loved one is left there, and the whirl begins to settle, and you get into that first layer, which I call reality, and that's the most painful time. It all lands. The reality doesn't just come and go, it's there, and you begin to realize that you're not going to see the person again. And you cry until you don't think you can cry anymore, but you can, and you call somebody and don't even know why you call them. And the pain, it's amazing how much physical pain there is in grief. It's painful, and you experience the pain, and you hurt. You know, I sometimes think we're worse off 3 weeks after the funeral than we are the day after, because we're in that shock period, and then all of a sudden it lands and we're there. I've wished that companies would allow people to come back to work pretty quickly and then give them time off later when the pain actually hits. When people are or in reality of grief, I think they need what I call the 3 H's. They need us to hang around, they need us to hug them, and they need us to hush. They don't need a lot of talk. They just need presence of people who will be with them during that period of pain. Gradually, we move from that very, very tough, painful part to the next layer of the onion, which I call the reaction layer. We begin to react to our grief.